The avoidant man does not run because he wants to. He runs because he feels like he has no other choice. Deep down, beneath the surface of his seemingly independent and detached nature, lies a fear so powerful that it dictates his every move in relationships. It's not about disinterest. It's not about not caring. It's about a belief system that has been ingrained in him for years. One that tells him that getting too close is dangerous. To truly understand why he pulls away, you have to look beyond his actions and into his core fear. This fear is not something he consciously chooses. It's something that has been built into his psyche through experiences, conditioning, and emotional survival mechanisms. At some point in his life, whether through childhood experiences, past relationships, or painful betrayals, he learned that emotional closeness leads to pain, obligation, or even loss of identity. For many avoidant men, this belief starts in childhood. Maybe he had parents who were emotionally unavailable, caregivers who didn't meet his needs or made love feel conditional. If he expressed emotions, maybe he was shut down, ignored, or even ridiculed. He learned that being vulnerable doesn't lead to connection, it leads to rejection. If he relied too much on others, it resulted in disappointment. If he opened up, it made him feel weak, exposed, or unworthy. So what does he do? He adapts. He learns to rely on himself. He builds walls around his emotions, creating an identity of independence. To him, self-sufficiency becomes his survival. He doesn't just prefer being alone, he needs it to feel safe. The idea of depending on someone else for emotional fulfillment feels like walking into a trap. It's not that he doesn't want love, it's that love has always felt like a risk he can't afford to take. Fast forward to adulthood. He meets someone who ignites something deep inside of him. Maybe for the first time in a long time, he feels something real, something intense. At first it's exciting. The passion is there, the chemistry is undeniable, and part of him wants to lean in. But then something shifts. The deeper the emotional connection grows, the stronger his fear becomes. This fear doesn't show up as panic or anxiety in the way you might expect. Instead, it manifests as distance. He starts to pull away. He gets busy. He stops responding as quickly. He starts creating space between himself and the relationship because internally, his nervous system is sending out alarms. This is dangerous. You're losing yourself. You're getting too close. And the closer someone tries to pull him in, the more resistance he feels. His mind tells him that staying means suffocation. It means obligation. It means losing his freedom. And even though part of him may desperately want to stay, the fear is louder. This is why logic doesn't work with an avoidant man. You can't convince him to stay by proving your love or reassuring him over and over. His fear isn't based on rational thinking. It's wired deep into his subconscious. It's not that he doesn't believe you love him. It's not that he doesn't care. It's that his core belief system is telling him that if he stays, he will lose something vital. His independence, his sense of control, his emotional safety. What makes this even more complicated is that many avoidant men don't even realize they have this fear. They don't wake up thinking, I'm afraid of intimacy, so I'm going to pull away today. No, in their minds, they believe their actions are justified. They tell themselves things like, I just need space. I'm not ready for something serious. I don't do well in relationships. I'm just not built for commitment. But underneath these justifications is the same core wound. The belief that if they stay too long, they will either be consumed by the relationship or eventually abandoned. Either way, the result is pain. So, they do what they've always done. They protect themselves by leaving first. This pattern repeats itself over and over again. They meet someone new, feel the rush of connection, enjoy it for a while, but then as soon as things get too deep, they instinctively retreat. It's not because they don't want love. It's because love has always felt unsafe. And here's what makes it even more frustrating for those who love an avoidant man. Deep down, he craves connection just like everyone else. He longs for love. He wants intimacy. But his mind and body are working against him. He has spent so long keeping his heart guarded that he doesn't know how to let himself be fully seen without feeling overwhelmed. This is why traditional approaches to relationships don't work with avoidant men. Pressuring him, chasing him, trying to break down his walls, it only reinforces his fear. The more someone tries to push, the more he pulls away, not because he wants to, but because his nervous system is wired to do so. His fear is real. His instinct to run is not about you. It's about survival. Until he recognizes this, until he understands that love and independence are not mutually exclusive, he will continue to repeat the same. The avoidant man prides himself on his independence. He wears it like armor, a badge of honor that tells the world, I don't need anyone. He has built a life around the idea that self-sufficiency equals strength, that relying on others is weakness, and that true freedom comes from never getting too attached. To him, relationships are not just about love. They represent a potential loss of autonomy. He believes that if he allows someone too close, he will be consumed, controlled, or forced to compromise in ways that make him feel trapped. The very thing that many people seek in relationships, emotional closeness, support, and partnership, feels like a threat to his identity. This belief doesn't come from nowhere. It's not that he woke up one day and decided he wanted to avoid emotional intimacy. It's the result of years of conditioning, experiences that reinforce the idea that relying on others leads to disappointment, pain, or even betrayal. For many avoidant men, independence became a survival mechanism early in life. Maybe he grew up in a household where he had to fend for himself emotionally. Perhaps his caregivers were inconsistent, dismissive, or even overbearing, making him feel like closeness always came with strings attached. If love felt conditional, if he only received warmth and approval when he behaved a certain way, he learned to equate relationships with obligations rather than genuine connection. Over time, this conditioning solidified into a deep-seated belief: if I rely on myself, I will never be hurt. If I stay emotionally distant, I will never be vulnerable. If I don't depend on anyone, I will never be let down. And so he builds his life around this illusion. He convinces himself that being alone is preferable, that he doesn't need a partner to feel whole, that relationships are more trouble than they're worth. He may even avoid deep friendships or any situation that requires too much emotional investment. On the surface, he appears completely self-sufficient. He takes care of himself, handles his responsibilities, and creates a world where he is in control. But here's the truth. His independence isn't real independence. It's avoidance disguised as strength. Because true independence isn't about isolation. It isn't about shutting people out or refusing to engage in deep emotional bonds. Real independence is about having the ability to stand on your own while still allowing yourself to connect with others. It's about knowing that you are capable of taking care of yourself, but that opening up to love and support doesn't take that away from you. The avoidant man doesn't see this. To him, dependence on anyone, even emotionally, feels like a loss of control. He believes that once he lets someone in, he is at risk. Risk of being judged, risk of being needed too much, risk of having to give more than he is capable of, risk of getting hurt. This is why the moment he feels someone getting too close, he starts to retreat. Not necessarily in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts. He may become less responsive, more distant, suddenly too busy for deep conversations. If he feels like expectation are forming around the relationship, he starts looking for escape routes, ways to reestablish his emotional independence. He tells himself that he just needs space. But the reality is his need for space is often a reflex, a way to restore his sense of control before he feels consumed. The most ironic part of all of this is that, despite his desperate need for independence, the avoidant man is not actually free. Because real freedom isn't about running. It's not about avoiding emotional depth. It's about choice. The choice to connect without fear, to love without feeling trapped, to let people in without feeling like you are losing yourself. But he has spent so long convincing himself that relationships mean entrapment that he doesn't see another way. Even when he does enter a relationship, he often structures it in a way that preserves his illusion of independence. He may prefer casual relationships with no defined labels. He may gravitate toward partners who are emotionally unavailable themselves, creating a dynamic where no one gets too close. He might even sabotage deeper connections just to prove to himself that he is still in control. But no matter how much he avoids, no matter how much he tells himself he's better off alone, something inside him still craves connection. Because despite his best efforts, he is human, and humans are wired for connection. The truth is, his avoidance is not freedom, it's fear in disguise. He isn't running towards something better, he's running away from something unresolved. And until he recognizes that his independence is an illusion, he will continue to live in a cycle where relationships feel like a threat rather than a source of strength. The avoidant man is a runner. He pulls away when things get too close, distances himself when emotions become intense, and convinces himself that he is better off alone. He does this not because he wants to, but because his mind has been conditioned to believe that staying means losing himself. His default response to deep emotional connection is to retreat until he encounters one thing powerful enough to override that instinct. What is it? Emotional safety. Not love, not passion, not logic, not effort. Emotional safety is the one thing that stops the avoidant man from leaving. It's the invisible force that neutralizes his fear of entrapment. The only thing that makes closeness feel like something he can handle instead of something he has to escape. At his core, the avoidant man does not actually fear intimacy. What he fears is what intimacy has represented in his past. In his mind, emotional closeness is tied to obligation, loss of autonomy, judgment, or even rejection. He is not avoiding love, he is avoiding the pain he has associated with love. And because his nervous system is wired to see closeness as a threat, the moment a relationship starts to require more emotional presence, his mind activates survival mode. But emotional safety changes the equation. When a man feels emotionally safe, something in him relaxes. His nervous system stops screaming at him to run. His mind no longer views the relationship as a trap. Instead of feeling like he is being pulled into something suffocating, he starts to experience connection as a choice, something he can lean into instead of something he has to resist. But what does emotional safety actually look like? It's not about walking on eggshells around him. It's not about suppressing your needs or making yourself smaller just to accommodate his fear. Emotional safety is about creating an environment where he does not feel like his autonomy is under threat. For an avoidant man, this means a few things. No pressure to be different than he is. If he feels like he constantly has to be more available, more expressive, or more open just to keep someone happy, he will retreat. His fear of failure will kick in, and he will convince himself that he is not capable of meeting the emotional demands of the relationship. But if he feels like he is accepted as he is, without the expectation to change overnight, his defenses come down. The freedom to take emotional steps at his own pace. Avoidant men are slow to trust emotional closeness, not because they don't want it, but because they fear losing themselves in it. When he feels like he can move forward on his own terms without being forced, guilted, or rushed, he starts to associate the relationship with comfort instead of pressure. The ability to express himself without fear of being criticized or controlled. Many avoidant men grew up in environments where emotional expression led to punishment, dismissal, or manipulation. If he feels like opening up will be met with judgment or emotional punishment, he will shut down again. But if he knows that his thoughts and feelings, however limited, will be received without immediate correction, he begins to let his guard down. A dynamic where distance does not equal punishment. One of the biggest triggers for an avoidant man is the feeling that any request for space will be met with rejection or emotional retaliation. If he pulls away and the response is anger, silence, or guilt, his fear is confirmed. Relationships are dangerous. I can't ask for space without losing everything. But if he experiences a different response, if he sees that space does not mean the end of connection, his subconscious starts to unlearn the idea that closeness is a trap, a relationship where connection feels like an option, not an obligation. The moment an avoidant man feels like he has to do something in a relationship, his mind starts looking for an escape. He is wired to resist emotional demands, even if they are reasonable. But if he feels like he is choosing connection rather than being forced into it, he starts to move toward it willingly. Emotional safety works because it does not force him to battle his fear head on. It does not demand that he override his lifelong conditioning overnight. Instead, it allows his nervous system to gradually learn a new reality. Closeness does not have to mean control. Love does not have to mean loss of self. And when that realization sinks in, something shifts. He no longer sees relationships as a threat to his autonomy. He no longer feels like he has to run just to preserve his sense of self. He no longer associates closeness with pain. Instead, he starts to see it as something he can engage with on his own terms, without losing the freedom he has worked so hard to protect. The avoidant man isn't making a conscious decision to pull away. He isn't waking up each morning thinking, how can I sabotage this relationship today? His distancing behaviors, his withdrawal, his hesitance, his fear of deep emotional connection are not choices. They are automatic responses deeply ingrained in his nervous system. To understand why he avoids intimacy, you have to understand how his brain has been wired to react to emotional closeness. His behavior is not just a personality trait, it's a conditioned survival response. His mind and body have been trained, often since childhood, to associate love with risk, not in an obvious way, but in a way that's deeply embedded in his subconscious. The moment things start to feel too close, too intimate, too emotionally demanding, his brain triggers a fight or flight response. He feels an internal alarm, warning him that he is stepping into dangerous territory. He may not be able to explain why he feels this way. He may not even be fully aware of it, but his body responds as if he is under threat. This response is called emotional flooding. When an avoidant man experiences emotional flooding, his nervous system becomes overwhelmed. His brain processes closeness not as something warm and fulfilling, but as something overwhelming and suffocating. His heart rate might increase, his muscles might tense, and his mind immediately starts looking for an escape route. He shuts down, he distances himself, he withdraws. This is why conversations about feelings can feel unbearable to him. This is why deep emotional intimacy, instead of drawing him in, often makes him feel trapped. This is why he may genuinely care about someone, but still find himself pulling away when things start to feel too real. because his brain has been wired to avoid emotional intensity at all costs. But just as the brain can be wired to fear closeness, it can also be rewired to experience connection in a different way. Rewiring an avoidant man's emotional triggers does not mean forcing him to become someone he is not. It does not mean demanding that he open up overnight. It means helping his nervous system learn that connection is not a threat. How does this happen? Lowering the emotional intensity. When an avoidant man feels overwhelmed, his instinct is to shut down. If every interaction feels emotionally intense, whether it's a deep conversation, an argument, or a demand for more connection, his nervous system will default to withdrawal. The key is to dial down the pressure in moments when he starts to pull away. When the intensity decreases, his brain stops sounding the alarm and he can stay engaged. This doesn't mean avoiding real conversations or suppressing emotions. It means understanding that if he feels like he is being forced into an emotional confrontation, he will instinctively retreat. But if emotions are presented in a calm, steady, and non-threatening way, he can stay present without feeling overwhelmed, creating experiences of safe connection. For an avoidant man to rewire his emotional triggers, he has to start associating relationships with safety rather than threat. This means that every moment of connection that doesn't trigger his flight response is a step toward healing. This can happen in simple, everyday moments. A conversation that is lighthearted instead of intense. Physical closeness that feels natural instead of forced. A moment of connection where he is not being asked to give more than he can handle. These small experiences send a new message to his brain. Being close doesn't have to mean losing control. Over time, these experiences compound, slowly shifting his subconscious belief system about relationships. Teaching his nervous system that space does not mean abandonment. One of the biggest fears of an avoidant man is that closeness means losing his ability to take space. He believes that if he allows someone too close, he will no longer have the freedom to step away when he needs to. This fear makes him resistant to relationships because in his mind, love means constant emotional obligation. To rewire this trigger, he has to experience a different reality. One where he can step back without being punished for it. This means that when he withdraws, the reaction isn't anger, guilt, or demands for more connection. Instead, it's met with trust. Trust that space does not mean disconnection. Trust that he will return when he is ready. Trust that closeness is something he can come back to rather than something that is forced upon him. Helping him associate vulnerability with relief instead of stress. For most avoidant men, vulnerability feels like pressure. They have learned that opening up means exposing themselves to judgment, criticism, or control. They have never experienced vulnerability as something freeing. The key to rewiring this emotional trigger is to make vulnerability feel like relief instead of stress. This happens when emotional conversations are met with understanding instead of urgency. When he shares something and the response is acceptance rather than pressure. When he expresses a feeling and it is received without expectations for him to change or fix it. When his nervous system starts associating vulnerability with safety instead of fear, he stops seeing emotional connection as something to avoid. Reinforcing small moments of emotional openness. For an avoidant man, deep emotional change doesn't happen in one big realization. It happens in small, repeated moments of emotional success. Every time he shares something and is met with safety, his brain records it. Every time he reaches out and is not met with pressure, his nervous system remembers it. Every time he experiences closeness in a way that does not overwhelm him, his subconscious belief about relationships starts to shift. This is how his emotional triggers begin to rewire. It is not about demanding that he be different. It is about creating experiences where connection feels safe instead of threatening. And when this happens enough times, his mind and body stop associating closeness with fear. The avoidant man has spent his life keeping love at arm's length. He has trained himself to believe that deep emotional closeness is something to be managed, tolerated, or in most cases avoided entirely. Not because he doesn't want love, but because in his mind, love equals risk. Love equals pressure. Love equals the possibility of losing himself. But there is a turning point, a moment when something shifts inside him, a moment when he stops seeing love as something that threatens his freedom and starts seeing it as something that enhances his life instead of consuming it. This turning point doesn't come from force. It doesn't come from being told you need to change. It doesn't even come from logical reasoning. It comes from experience. A deeply ingrained fear cannot be talked away. It has to be felt away. The avoidant man reaches this turning point only when he starts to experience love in a new way. When he begins to realize on a visceral level that closeness does not have to mean suffocation, and that staying does not have to mean losing himself. So, what triggers this shift? When he realizes that love does not demand that he change who he is. For an avoidant man, relationships have always felt like a silent negotiation. He believes that in order to stay, he has to become someone different. More expressive, more emotionally available, more open. But the more he feels pressured to be someone he's not, the more he withdraws. The turning point happens when he starts to experience a relationship where he is not required to perform, where he is accepted as he is, instead of feeling like he has to constantly prove his love through emotional expressions that don't come naturally to him. The moment he realizes he can be loved for who he is, rather than who he is expected to be, his nervous system begins to relax. The tension that has always accompanied closeness begins to dissolve. Instead of feeling like he's constantly disappointing someone's emotional expectations, he starts to see that love can be a place of acceptance rather than pressure. When he sees that emotional connection does not mean loss of independence, his biggest fear in relationships has always been entrapment. He believes that if he gets too close, he will lose himself. That love will demand more than he is capable of giving. This belief keeps him from fully committing, from fully investing, from fully staying. But the turning point comes when he starts to see that connection and independence are not opposites. That being in a relationship does not mean sacrificing his autonomy. That he can have both closeness and space, love and freedom. This happens when he realizes that love is not a cage, it's a choice. When he sees that he can step towards someone without feeling like he is being pulled into something suffocating. When he understands that his emotions are not a burden. Avoidant men often grew up in environments where emotions were either dismissed, ridiculed, or met with overwhelming expectations. Because of this, they learned to shut down their emotional world, not just in relationships, but within themselves. They are not emotionally unavailable because they lack emotions. They are emotionally unavailable because they believe their emotions are a liability. The turning point happens when an avoidant man starts to see that his emotions are not something to suppress or hide. When he begins to trust that expressing his feelings, even in small ways, will not lead to criticism, judgment, or obligation. When he realizes that he doesn't have to be all in emotionally right away, in order to stay. This happens through consistent experiences where his emotional world is met with acceptance rather than expectation. When he recognizes that leaving is not the only way to protect himself. For most of his life, the avoidant man has relied on one strategy to maintain control: distance. Whenever he feels emotionally overwhelmed, he withdraws. Whenever love feels too intense, he convinces himself that leaving is the only option. The turning point comes when he starts to see that there are other ways to regulate his emotions, that leaving is not the only way to maintain a sense of self. This happens when he learns that he can take space without cutting off connection, that he can ask for what he needs without it leading to conflict, that he can communicate his emotions, however limited, without it leading to suffocating demands. The moment he understands that he can stay and still have space, he stops relying on distance as his primary coping mechanism. When he experiences love as a safe place, not a battlefield. The biggest shift for an avoidant man happens when he realizes that love does not have to be a constant battle of expectations, needs, and emotional obligations. For years, his relationships may have felt like power struggles, one person trying to get closer while he instinctively tries to maintain space. This push and pull dynamic reinforces his belief that love is stressful, overwhelming, and exhausting. But the turning point happens when he experiences a relationship that does not feel like a battle. When connection feels like something he can choose, rather than something he has to protect himself from. When he starts to see that love can be a source of peace rather than pressure. This does not happen instantly. It is not a grand realization that changes him overnight. It happens through small, repeated experiences that teach his nervous system that love is not something he has to guard himself against. Over time, his brain begins to rewire. His default response to closeness starts to shift. He begins to see that love does not have to be a struggle between staying and leaving. It can be a place where he can finally rest. The avoidant man has spent his life believing that his best defense against emotional overwhelm is distance. He's mastered the art of pulling away, of staying just detached enough to maintain his sense of control. His nervous system has been wired to associate closeness with entrapment, with pressure, with the eventual loss of himself. But what happens when for the first time he begins to see that staying is not a loss? What happens when the thought of commitment no longer feels like something he has to guard against? What happens when, instead of running, he starts making the choice to remain present? That moment doesn't come through force. It doesn't happen because someone convinces him with words or logic. It doesn't even happen because he's afraid of losing someone. It happens because, for the first time, staying feels better than leaving. That shift is monumental. For the avoidant man, every past relationship has felt like a slow march toward a decision he didn't want to make. Stay and feel trapped, or leave and feel relief. But when his experience of love begins to change, when he starts to feel safe, autonomous, and in control within a relationship, he stops seeing leaving as his only escape. He stops equating connection with a loss of self. He begins to choose to stay. One, when he no longer feels like love is a threat. For most of his life, love has felt like a battle, something he had to manage, negotiate, or escape from. He spent years believing that the deeper he lets someone in, the more he risks losing himself. But the turning point happens when he begins to experience love differently, when connection no longer feels like a threat to his identity, when he realizes that he can be loved for who he is, rather than who he is expected to become. This realization doesn't happen in an instant. It's something that builds over time through repeated experiences of safety. Every time he's allowed to take space without being punished for it. Every time his emotional distance isn't met with desperation or control. Every time he is given the freedom to be himself without expectation, his nervous system registers a new truth. I don't have to run. 2, when he learns that closeness does not mean losing his autonomy. The biggest fear for an avoidant man is losing his independence. He has spent his life believing that relationships demand too much, that love requires constant emotional labor, that intimacy means sacrificing his sense of freedom. But staying becomes his choice when he realizes that being in a relationship does not mean losing himself, that love does not require his constant availability, that he can be close and still be his own person. This shift happens when he starts to see that his need for space does not have to be a deal breaker, that he can step back when he needs to without fearing that the relationship will collapse, that he can express his emotions in his own way without feeling like he is constantly failing someone else's expectations. The more he experiences this, the less he feels the need to protect himself from closeness. He begins to relax into connection rather than resist it. 3, when he realizes that love can feel like home, not a battlefield. For most avoidant men, relationships have felt like power struggles. One person trying to get closer while they instinctively pull away. This cycle reinforces their belief that love is draining, overwhelming, and filled with expectations they can never meet. But staying becomes his choice when he experiences a relationship that does not feel like a war zone. When he realizes that love can be peaceful. When he sees that connection does not always have to be a constant battle between space and closeness. This happens when he starts experiencing connection in small, manageable ways. Through laughter, through shared moments, through quiet understanding. When he sees that not every conversation has to be emotionally intense, that not every moment of distance has to be met with fear, that not every request for closeness has to come with an obligation. The less love feels like a battlefield, the more he begins to trust it. 4, when he understands that leaving no longer feels like freedom. For an avoidant man, leaving has always been the ultimate relief. The moment things felt too intense, too emotional, too demanding, leaving was his way of reclaiming control. He believed that distance was his only way to protect himself. But staying becomes his choice when he realizes that leaving no longer brings him the same sense of freedom. When he sees that distance does not actually make him feel better, it only leaves him feeling disconnected, isolated, and deep down, unsatisfied. This happens when he starts to understand that the sense of freedom he was chasing through avoidance was never actually freedom. It was fear disguised as independence. When he begins to experience a relationship where he still feels like himself, where he still has control over his own life, where he still gets to move at his own pace, he stops seeing escape as his only option. He begins to recognize that true freedom does not come from running. It comes from staying and still feeling whole. 5, when he feels safe enough to stay without feeling forced. For an avoidant man, pressure is the ultimate enemy. The moment he feels like he has to stay, he starts looking for a way out. The moment he feels like his presence is demanded rather than chosen, he starts to shut down. But staying becomes his choice when he feels safe enough to stay without being forced. When he realizes that his commitment is valued but not required. When he feels like he is choosing love on his own terms rather than being pushed into it. This happens when he experiences a relationship where his boundaries are respected, where he is not constantly being asked to give more than he can handle, where he is allowed to take steps toward connection at his own pace. The more he feels that staying is his decision rather than something that is being demanded of him, the more he starts to feel comfortable staying. 6 out of 8 when he recognizes that love is not about obligation, it's about choice. The final shift happens when he stops seeing relationships as something he has to do and starts seeing them as something he wants to do. For so long, love has felt like an obligation to him, something that requires constant effort, constant emotional vulnerability, constant sacrifice. But staying becomes his choice when he experiences love as a source of joy rather than a source of pressure. When he sees that love does not have to be exhausting. When he realizes that being with someone does not have to mean constant emotional work. When he experiences connection in a way that feels fulfilling, not draining. And when that moment comes, when he no longer sees love as something to survive, but something he actually wants to embrace, he finally stops running. This is why purpose is the keynote of all greatness, the idea of purpose. Because at last, staying feels better than leaving.